Welcome to CES 2021, the all-digital virtual version here in this new world. I hope all of you had a safe and happy new year. We're here today to talk about continued transformation in the automotive industry with the specific focus on electrification and vehicle connectivity. My name is Masa Hasegawa, Automotive OEM Sector Leader for Deloitte, and I'll be your moderator today. We have an excellent panel of speakers lined up here today, starting with Steve Carlisle, Executive Vice President and President of North America for General Motors. Scott Beutler, Head of Vehicle Networking and Information North America for Continental AG. Joe Britton, Executive Director for the Zero Emission Transportation Association, or ZETA. And finally, Jody Stidham, Managing Director and a leader in Deloitte's global automotive practice. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, before we kick off the panel, I want to start the conversation with the unveiling of the 2021 Global Automotive Consumer Study. From September through October of 2020, Deloitte surveyed more than 24,000 consumers across 23 countries to explore opinions regarding the variety of critical issues affecting the automotive sector, including development and acceptance of advanced technologies. The 2021 Global Automotive Consumer Study provides important insights that can help companies prioritize and better position their business strategies and investments in the years to come. We hope you enjoy this study. The study can be found in the link shown here. So with that, let's get into our panel. The topic of electric vehicles is something that is not necessarily new to the industry. It's been talked about. There's been products out there over 2 decades now. But when you think about the momentum that it's gained recently, and I want to say in the last couple of years or so, with respect to many of the new entrants coming into the industry, lots of really bold commitments and announcements that have been made by many of the manufacturers, it's really easy to notice that there's a groundswell, a momentum that's building up around electrification. So I'm going to start with you, Steve. Here we are in the early part of the new decade. Why so much momentum? Why here and now?
It's a combination of things, Masa. I think it's a coming together of, you mentioned 2 decades that's gone into this. I think we're seeing a technology that is now ready for commercialization at scale, meaning that we can see a profitable future. We can address what have been considered barriers to adoption in the past, things like range anxiety, charging times, charging infrastructure, certainly in a much better shape than it's been until now. And then there's enough, I think, on the road now. People are starting to see them and understand them. The technology is becoming more popularized. And I think you take that also in conjunction with some of the broader trends in terms of concerns about the environment and the like of that. And it feels like all the necessary elements for a big push through the inflection point towards adoption are really upon us.
That's really insightful. Now, Scott, maybe turn it over to you. You know, from an enabling technology standpoint, getting electric vehicle to the marketplace isn't just merely about replacing the ICV powertrain with motors and batteries and off you go. There's a whole slew of new set of technologies that are part of the equation. From a supplier standpoint, tell me a little bit more about where we are in this journey and why here and now.
Well, for us, you know, the electrification brings in new opportunities for connectivity. And it goes to one point that Steve made. You know, there is anxiety about, you know, how much range and where will I charge? How will the billing for charging occur? You know, so all of that needs to be accommodated to relieve the convenience fare factors that the consumers have when it comes to electrification. And connectivity, quite frankly, will bring in a lot of other aspects of safety relevance for the vehicles as well. And I think that's something to be considered as well.
So tell me a little bit more about that safety aspect. Now, When I think about EV, I always think about it in terms of yet another mode of propulsion. But tell me more about technology and how that's affecting safety.
Well, first off, the way we look at it from a tier one into the OEMs is, we're looking at different architectures of cars for the internal. So it's high performance compute platforms that will allow information from all zones. It's a little bit of a different architecture setup, but allows information from the different zones in the vehicle to be easily gathered and computed by the HPC, high performance compute, and then that information can either be disseminated to the user in the car, or can be communicated to the cloud, such that it can be utilized by other users on the road. And I think it's important to understand that 5G, for instance, will bring the capability of V2X, which I think will go a long way to relieving possibly congestion, potentially auto accidents, potentially fatalities when vehicles and pedestrians are also involved. And I think those aspects of some of the technology is really going to advance where we're trying to go from an emissions and a fatalities perspective.
When you talked about a number of different facets of advancement of technologies that are all kind of coming together at the confluence, it's almost like a perfect storm of you mentioned 5G, you mentioned all sorts of new types of computing capabilities and so on and so forth. Sounds like all of that is really kind of creating this groundswell for a publicly acceptable product. Does that seem right to you, Steve?
Yeah, it sure does. We put it in the context of what we call our 3-0 strategy: zero emission, zero congestion, and zero collision. So we see all these technologies playing together in a very compelling package from a consumer point of view, and it does bring together the electrification technologies and the connectivity and the automated driving ones. And so we wrap that all up, and that's a very compelling safety package overall.
So as we think about the evolution or the accelerated evolution of all these things that are happening, Joe, I'm going to turn to you next. Tell us a little bit about, first of all, Zeta's mission. And my question to you is, what's the role that government and the regulators have to play in order to keep this moving, or in some cases to accelerate all of this?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think it's important to note Zeta's influence in the space is that we're a group of folks that are pushing for every vehicle sold by 2030 to be an EV, and that's throughout all 8 classes. Some classes may be more ambitious than others, but what we really want to see the federal government do is, on the investment side, have a consumer incentive that's a point of sale incentive that's giving the consumer that value up front, which is really, really important. And then investing in the charging infrastructure throughout the country that meets every community's needs. There's a huge gap to be closed there. But then the other thing that I think is really important, and we've got a new incoming EPA that we know is looking at this, is we do need to have greenhouse gas and fuel efficiency standards that send a market signal that this is a 10 or 15-year transition, not a 40 or 50-year transition. So those are just some of the things that we've been engaging with the new administration on. And, we represent EV manufacturers, battery sector, charging, supply chain like lithium and cobalt, and then a host of utilities that have kind of an unfettered interest in accelerating the transition to electric vehicles. And so we'll be reaching out to members of Congress and the administration in order to kind of put the building blocks in place. We're not going to be asking for a ZEV mandate or a gas-powered car ban like we've seen in California, the UK, and Japan, but we're putting the building blocks in place to make that possible. And ultimately, like we've already talked about, we need the consumers to be the ones making these choices. And so building those blocks with public policy makes it all possible.
Now, let's focus on that last point about consumers, right? Because ultimately it comes down to the consumers making their choices, et cetera. Steve and Scott, you started the conversation by talking about, the past with the things such as range anxiety, so on and so forth. Now, here we are in 2021, as we look forward into the new decade. Where are our consumer sentiments with respect to EVs today? And where do we see this evolving going forward as we get into the mid-decade or the later part of the decade? Steve, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think consumer interest and willingness to consider is improving, increasing virtually every day. We look, one way that we look at it is we look at, well, what, and it's a popular question of what percentage of the total market will be battery electric vehicle and by what date. And, no matter what the estimate is at a given point in time, we know that it's going to increase at a future point in time. So I think that this transformation from a consumer point of view is actually well underway. I think we're well along the way. We've made a commitment. We want to be able to put everyone into an EV in whatever category within the foreseeable future. And certainly we see the decade that we're in as a transformational one. So like I say, all the indicators are there. The more the market research work that we do, you can put a compelling product in front of a consumer within the context of the kind of services that we've talked about. And at some level, it doesn't matter whether it's internal combustion or whether it's battery electric vehicle. They're going to be interested in it if we're not asking them to make compromises versus what they're used to. So, and which is why we made the commitments that we have. The 30 new EVs by 2025, and to be able to ultimately put everyone in every category into an EV. So. It's well underway, and which is why we're ramping up on the communications of that and ramping up on our launch schedule of these new products.
Okay. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I was just going to add one point. I mean, from a consumer perspective as well, as we transition to electric vehicles, and there will be a need for connectivity there. One of the areas that consumers are reflecting on and concerned about is security of data inflow and outflow. And it's something that we're very cognizant of to make sure that we have the intelligent software and the right partnerships in place to make sure that that flow of information is very secure.
Mm-hmm. Really good point. Jody, you have been extensive experience in the industry looking at customer experience and the relationship consumers have with brands. Tell me a little bit about what you see with respect to electric vehicles, both challenges as well as opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Masa. So, this is a really profound time in the automotive industry, and it's a really exciting and big step forward. There's a lot of change, right, going on. There's the in-vehicle interface, there's dealer interactions, everything from service to, everyday use and peace of mind on range that have to be thought of. So this, entire journey needs to be reimagined in a way that addresses all of those customer pain points. And I think that, while we talk about, range anxiety, it's a lifestyle change, right? While our data suggests that a majority of consumers are going to charge their vehicles at home overnight, there's still quite a few that don't have that capability. And so we need to think about the lifestyle of everyone if our mission is to have EVs for all, and think about creating much greater personalized content that speaks to those individuals at every step of the journey to really address those pain points. And I agree with you, Steve. The time is now. We need to start communicating and educating and creating a two-way dialogue with consumers to listen to what's on their mind so that we can really start to improve that consideration set now. COVID has really demonstrated that, digital can have a profound impact on the way we reach consumers. And with the recent, launches out there and the significant number of viewers that have watched those, it's our chance to listen and learn from customers that are engaging in those launches and start to evolve that conversation in a much more rapid way that, really hones in on the top factors that are, driving concerns with adoption, like range anxiety and even affordability.
Yeah. So,
and I think
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think one more point, would be remiss if I didn't add that, we need to think about the dealers in this space and engaging them now, rather than waiting until we have the product and doing traditional product training, starting with them now and helping them understand how the customer experience needs to evolve and getting them much more comfortable with what that new journey is going to look like, and making them a part of it is really important.
Now, Jody, you touched upon one topic that I want to just pick a little bit more on, which is around affordability. Maybe I'll start with a question to you, Joe. You mentioned earlier about incentives, financial incentives that are needed at the moment. What does that look like in terms of, is there such thing as a hurdle that we need to clear in order to get the consumer over the edge in the form of mass adoption? Is this still an affordability problem that we need to solve?
Well, I guess I would remind folks that there's already a host of EVs on the market that you can get for an MSRP that's lower than their internal combustion engine sedan counterpart. So they're making progress now, and I think many of the EV OEMs will tell you that they're approaching the $100 per kilowatt hour price point on the battery. I think in the next several years, we'll be getting closer to $75. And I think by 2030, many think that we'll be at a $50 per kilowatt hour for the pack. And so that'll help us, on the battery side, get where, that fixed cost for the battery pack is not, $12,000 or $10,000, but it's under $10,000. So we're making progress on that front. The reason that it's really important to have a consumer incentive, though, in this place is to catalyze the industry. I think once folks drive an EV, 95% of them will tell you that their next car is going to be an EV. And I think the other thing that's important to note here is that right now we've got about 17 million new car sales every year, but we have 40 million used car sales. So we have twice as many buyers or more that are, buying a used car. And if you think about it, how many used cars did you buy before you bought your first new car? And so I think the more that we, supply and prime that secondary market, the more that we can reach more Americans. I think that's one of the impediments is that if people think going electric means that they have to afford a new car, you're automatically, counting out 2/3 of Americans when you look at the car market. And so the more vehicles that we can get into the market now, these first 2 or 3 years of this decade are really, really important because that primes the secondary market. You can do that through rentals. You can do that through leasing. You can do that through fleet and federal deployment of electric vehicles. So that's a huge part of this. But if we're falling behind from a policy standpoint, that means that we're ceding this commercial opportunity to foreign commercial interests. And so it's important for the federal government as a public policy matter to help cultivate this sector so that we can make progress and keep up. And really, if you look back at the last 2 or 3 decades, the electric vehicle is going to be one of the success stories of American manufacturing. And so that's really the story that we try to tell. Obviously, you can come to EVs because, it's decarbonization, it's reducing mobile source pollution, it's good for the consumer with torque and performance and fuel and maintenance costs. But really, this is an economic opportunity where we can create jobs in every congressional district in the country. And so that's really the value of that consumer incentive, having the federal government invest in the charging infrastructure and close those gaps. We talked about at-home charging. It's those other use cases that are especially important for the federal government to help fill, which is your on-street, your multi-unit, your retail. Those are all areas where we can supplement for folks who, aren't your suburban single-family home. They're going to be having a level 1 or level 2 in their garage. So that's why it's important to have the federal government invested here.
I just want to add in there too, Masa, that I think it's important to talk about total cost of ownership. When consumers go, to buy a car today, it's all about that monthly payment, and they really don't think in the back of their mind just how much everything else is going to cost them throughout the life of the vehicle. And I think putting a focus on that in regards to EVs will be really important because there still is a lot of unknowns about how much it will cost to charge and what will the maintenance look like on my vehicle.
And Mawson, I might jump in again and just remind folks that in the secondary market, if you think about it, the latter half of the life of a vehicle is where you're going to have the most maintenance and service costs. And so that's where the contrast between an internal combustion engine vehicle and an EV that has dramatically fewer parts, you really will accrue a lot of those savings. And and I think Jody's point is good because And that's why if we reform the 30D tax credit to make it a point of sale, you get rid of the discounting that the consumer does. If they're accruing that value 8 or 9 months down the road, they discount the value of it, much like with the service and maintenance costs. If this is some ethereal 8 years, 9 years down the road that they're going to be accruing some level of savings, that doesn't get factored into a net present value standpoint like a fleet buyer would. And that's important for us in the light, medium, and heavy duty space, that we're actually a lot closer with those buyers because they'll amortize it and they'll know exactly what the value of those savings and maintenance costs are over time. And so it, again, is important for us to not only think about the retail buyer, but some of these other applications in the light, medium, and heavy duty fleet space.
But I think also one more point to add, right, due to, connectivity, or with the, ability to have connectivity comes the opportunity for greater over-the-air updates. And I think from a consumer perception, if positioned correctly, consumers will perceive that helps appreciate their vehicle and keep it fresh, keep it newer, so that the vehicle isn't depreciating like a normal ICE vehicle would versus, greater depreciation towards the end of that life cycle.
So it sounds like there's almost like a new formula to be written with respect to everything EV that is very different from the ICV legacy, if you will, when it comes to valuation of and the total cost of ownership aspect of it. Here I am thinking that there's going to be more and more shiny new products coming into the marketplace that are electric. And the notion of, to quote a famous movie, if you build it, they will come, seemed very one-dimensional in terms of more shiny products. I'm curious, Steve, from General Motors' perspective, you are, one of many manufacturers in this race over the next several years to come out with all sorts of products across all the segments in the marketplace. How do you see the competition evolving as we move forward, as more and more products are offered in this marketplace?
Well, I would expect it to, like another technology or another adoption cycle, I would expect it to play out in a similar way, in that, you can expect more activity in certain segments or categories at a point in time. But then, the market will start to differentiate and fragment, and I think everyone will be compelled to participate in every segment where there are consumers over time. But I think in the case of EVs, it's sooner versus later. To the affordability point, I'd point out, our goal with the Bolt EV when we launched it almost exactly 4 years ago, almost to the day. I'd have to go and double check that. Our goal was to make the first, long range, affordable, accessible EV. And the reason for that is if we're going to make a difference in the overall equation on the environment, we need to be where the market is, and to some extent that's determined by price point, which is why we have a mid-cycle on the Bolt EV coming next year, and then the Bolt EUV, another, so to offer more functionality. Because the way I think about it is that people will they'll be interested in the vehicle based on things that they've always been interested in, like styling and performance and all that. And some of what we're talking about with EVs is to take away what are perceived as compromises and pain points that we've talked about a lot in the conversation so far. And, happily, we're now in a position to do that as an industry, and we certainly believe that we can do that as a company. We've taken steps in terms of some of this is resource allocation. What are you going to focus on to create what outcomes? So we've put in place a senior executive in charge of, we call it the EV growth operations. And the sole purpose of Travis Hester is his name. The sole purpose of that job is to let's take on these barriers to adoption and let's get to work on them wherever they are in the value chain, whether it's charging infrastructure or customer experience or dealers, and training and education to take away the pain points or address the pain points or remove the barriers to adoption. The product is very soon going to get to the point where it's not presenting compromises, and they'll be styled attractively. They'll offer functionality. They'll have terrific new connectivity, brought in services and in-market enhancements and over-the-air updates and all that. All that's here today. Whether it's ICE or BEV, it's coming together at this really cool time in our history and the transformation of the industry.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about, you just rattled off a whole bunch of transformation in one sentence, Steve. And part of it is kind of giving us a peek inside into what's happening at General Motors, but also across the value chain, across the extended value chain in the industry. Tell me a little bit more about this transformation and how differently do you need to conduct your business going forward? If I think about the traditional value chain of automotive industry, you have the manufacturer, you have the suppliers, you have the dealers, and now how profound is this transformation in order to bring electric vehicles to the marketplace in mass? And change your relationship, if you will, with your consumers with the new set of technologies?
Well, I think it's different and it's the same, right? If we take the customer experience as an example, when we lay it all out kind of end to end and look at all the interaction points, there's probably about 70% of it you could say is common, whether it's ICE or whether it's electric vehicle. Maybe 30% of it is incremental to battery electric. So charging is, a really good example of that. But that 30% causes you, should motivate you to do things very differently, right? In terms of how we allocate resources, for instance. So, we see a world where ICE and BEV will coexist for a fairly long period of time. And so now we're managing, two sets of technologies, if you will, over a protracted period of time. So how you do that, and given that a lot of these technologies and their integration are fairly new, to be able to put the right focus on that from a resource allocation point of view. And I think it's also kind of mindset is also really important, where I think the industry sometimes gets the reputation of, well, battery electric is kind of discretionary, or it's regulatory or whatever. We need to think of it as being more existential. We need to view it as the end game and to really drive ourselves that way. So I think it has an impact on the what you do, because there are new technologies. We're far earlier on in terms of the taking batteries again on the cost curve. Some of the data was cited here just a few minutes ago, and we need to continue to drive that down by orders of magnitude. So that's all new. So that requires, a very, deliberate and intentional focus on specific items like that. But you step back, and where it's the same, we're dealing with a lot of the same partners. Suppliers are very integral to the effort. Our other R&D partners, our dealers are very much part of the equation. So a lot is the same, but there's some very important differences when it comes to the technology and addressing the barriers that we talked about that are quite different and require a very different focus in terms of resource allocation and then mindset, as I described.
Yeah. Scott, as you listen to Steve, what's your view from a supplier's point of view?
Oh, I agree with Steve. A lot of it is very similar, and whether it's, in our business, it's not all so dependent on ICV or electric, but we see much more response from consumers and our OEM partners that technology in electric vehicles is where to really introduce new innovation. And we've already, it's been mentioned a couple of times. Increasing the capability of improving features and functionality over the lifetime of a vehicle. Using 5G, for instance, where bandwidth is considerably increased, and download speeds almost real time. So it's as if you're upgrading your software on a daily basis, the way our mobile phones are today. And I think what's even important from an OEM perspective, but also from a consumer perspective, is that we're able to update the software within the electronic control units in the vehicle, which improves the performance of that vehicle and hopefully cuts down on the repair expenses for that vehicle over a lifetime. And I think those are the things that we're trying to, work with, not only the OEMs, but also the suppliers that make the high performance compute platforms possible, and the third party app suppliers that allow for, information control and information dissemination in a vehicle, not only for, for convenience, but also for, driver and, the outside world safety aspects. So I think this is the right time. People are very, I think they're ready for electric vehicle to bring in this transformation. And I think the new technologies as it comes from a tier one, specifically on connectivity and information sharing within the vehicle, is very important.
Steve,
Mas,
go
if
ahead.
I could offer just one more thought too. I think one thing that's really important to think about that's different is the skill sets required to execute all this, to pull it all off. And I think we're seeing that across the industry as well. We're becoming, or are, profoundly more software oriented than hardware. All the hardware is still there. The drivetrains we've talked about are changing in terms of technology. Mm-hmm. What's really changing profoundly is software, and that's quite a different skill set in the transition and the transformation that has to go with that. So I think we all share that as well.
So Steve, I'm going to pick on that a little bit because I agree with you. I mean, it's a profound shift in terms of the net new skill sets that's required going forward. How is your organization dealing with that? I mean, is this a, just go out and go hire software engineers? I mean, or what are all the different plays in your playbook that you're contemplating?
Yeah, it does involve that for sure. We recently, we've been on, in terms of where we situate ourselves, right? Where our engineering centers are, where our software centers are. That's part of it. And then we recently announced hiring 3,000 more engineers to come in and support that, and they'll be software and controls oriented individuals that we bring on board. It involves what we're investing in facilities, the types of labs that we're investing in, the types of partnerships that we're engaging in, joint ventures that we enter into. LG Chem is a good example in our Altium activity in Lordstown, Ohio. So it plays out in a number of different dimensions. If you want to take it to, let's say, an extreme, the investment that we made in Cruise on autonomous is another example of that. So I raise it because I think it is important and it's different. Is that reflect on what capabilities do you have, and then what do you need, and then to develop the roadmap to go from one to the next.
Mm-hmm. Joe, just sticking to the theme of partnerships and alliances for a second, right? If you extrapolate this further into beyond the auto industry and you have purview into the utility sector, so on and so forth, how do you see cross-industry collaboration taking shape?
Well, obviously on the charging side, you've got a host of third-party charging companies and utilities all trying to figure this out. I know GM recently announced a partnership with EVgo. We've got a host of both, nearly every charging company in the country and utilities that are really leaning into electric vehicles, thinking through how to, manage the load, deploy the infrastructure. And you've got to sequence that. I think, we want to make sure that we're, outpacing the vehicles so that we can assure the consumer that the charging opportunities will be there. But you don't want to outpace it and then have idle, capital investments. And so, I think in some ways the load and the generation is to be managed. But I think our biggest impediment is figuring out how and where the vehicle is going to be used and in what use cases, and how do we, manage the deployment of those in a smart way that meet the community's needs. And I think that's also an important part of this when you think about environmental justice and communities that face the disproportionate impact of mobile source emissions from the transportation sector. Engaging with those communities and figuring out what electrification looks like for them. For some, it may be transit, it may be multi-unit housing, it may be more retail. So I think engaging with those communities and ensuring that we're investing dollars that deliver a return, both for the consumer, but also for public health, are really, really important.
And does that extend also into we haven't really talked a little bit about this, but I think it's all part of the equation around electrifying, commercial vehicles, right? And heavy duty trucks or other aspects of this as well.
Yeah, it's interesting on the medium and heavy duty side. I was actually talking to FedEx yesterday. They're ready to buy tens of thousands of electric, class 4 through 8 vehicles. And the trouble is actually on the supply side. I think on the light duty side, you've got more of a demand lag than you do a supply lag. And I think on the medium and heavy duty, those folks are ready. Like I said, they can see the savings, and they know from just an economic standpoint that it's the right answer. So the more that this industry becomes, I think, diverse and distributed, and everybody is working to meet the demand of electrification, the better off we'll be. And I think, Steve mentioned this, but this is a very distributed sector right now. Obviously, 10 years ago, Tesla was an insurgent, but we have a dozen more of those right now between Lordstown and Lucid and Rivian, and Arrival on the medium and heavy duty side. Exos trucks. There's a host of folks that are, I think, applying pressure to some of the incumbents to meet the demand of consumers. And that's both the individual retail consumer and the fleet buyers. And it's important that we take that seriously, because if we don't, we know that these foreign commercial interests are, and we'll be importing these vehicles if we don't cultivate an American manufacturing base here that I think will require the startups that are in the ecosystem, but Ford and GM and Fiat Chrysler, the full spectrum. So I think there's more than enough, demand that is coming down the pike. We have to just make sure that the products are ready.
Yeah.
And Masa, I think this is another example of the maturation of the technology, right? Like 5 years ago, we wouldn't have talked about electric trucks, right? Just because, if you get into the math of it, the trade-off for payload versus the mass of the batteries and range and everything that we've talked about, it was difficult to intersect all that. And I think now you're seeing it will intersect, right?
Yes.
That brought us to the Hummer EV with some pretty awesome statistics in terms of what we expect out of it in terms of performance. So I'd offer that up as kind of an indication that we're on the trajectory to be able to meet the needs of use cases like that in the not distant future.
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe one question. So I'm going to ask this question to each of you. And it's a little bit of a fun question. But we're going to go Hollywood a little bit. In the movie Men in Black, I don't know if all of you have seen this, they use a device, a fictitious device, I think it's called a neuralizer, and you point it at somebody, and the bright light that comes out of it actually erases the memory of that person. And so my question to you is, if you happen to have a neuralizer and you could use it to the general consumers, right, to the public, what aspects or memory or preconceived notion of electric vehicles would you desire to erase from the consumers' minds? Judy, why don't I start with you?
I think I would erase the notion that an EV is not for me. We talked about here, there's a lot of amazing new technology coming. It seems overly complicated to, I think, a lot of the general mainstream consumers. I think we have an opportunity to simplify that a bit more and make sure everybody feels like it's for them.
Okay. Scott, you want to go next?
Yeah, for me, it's the battery charging time. It's amazing, when the need is there, technology and innovation sometimes solves it, and usually that's the case. So, I always say, don't fear change, because innovation will make things right.
How about you, Steve?
I would go the route of, let's say, a durability or reliability of the technology. Go back to earlier in the conversation, we talked a bit about mobile phones maybe 20 years ago or longer, and some of the issues that we dealt with then. I think that's out there as a conception, which I don't believe is true, that's impeding adoption. So that I would offer that one up.
And Joe, bring us home.
Well, I would erase the notion of ever being low on gas. I don't know if you guys have spouses that don't fill up when they should, and you get in their car for the first time of the week, it seems like it's always on empty. With EVs, you start every day with a full tank. You've got 10 times as much range as you'll ever need in a day for the average consumer. So I would erase the notion of ever being, having, low fuel. You start every single day with a full tank.
Awesome. So with that, we're going to wrap up today's panel. Thank you, Steve, Scott, Joe, Jody, for your time and insights. This was a tremendous conversation. I certainly learned a lot. So with that, we're going to wrap up. Now, be sure to check Deloitte.com for the latest set of studies and reports. But with that, we're going to wrap up. Again, thank you, CES 2021. And I hope all of you enjoy the session. Have a wonderful day. Take care.